Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It's 1:02, so let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today for the Lab Data Week webinar series. This session is facilitated by no, kidding, Simran and Ahmed. Their presentation has a very cute title. It's called Swipe Right on Surveys, Designing Questions Everyone Will Love. If you have any questions throughout the session, please leave them in the chat. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sim and Ahmed.
Cool. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today, and thank you for the introduction. So we'll be talking about just some general tips and tricks for designing questions for your surveys, and we'll give a little bit of background about some kind of strategy that we like to take note of when creating our surveys before getting into actual question creation. But yeah, if you have any questions throughout, you can feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will do our best to try to keep an eye on that throughout. The presentation. And I also will send the PowerPoint afterwards as well. There's some links to some resources at the end. But you will have all of this at your fingertips after the session is done as well. Cool. So I'll just start us off talking a little bit about like what our survey process is. And for context, for those of you who don't know, we are on the CRAFT team, which stands for Communication, Research, Assessment, Fundraising, and Technology. I know it's a mouthful. But we are hosted in the Division of Student Affairs. So a lot of our research does happen within the division, but we also do some more institutional projects. So it could be pretty usable for whichever area you're in. So please take what you can for whatever applies to you. And if there are any other questions or you think that our work might relate to you, you can always feel free to reach out to us afterwards, and we're always happy to collaborate. So when it comes to the survey process, just again, getting into the mindset of things, one of the first things in general before you even get to making your survey is thinking about what the point of your survey is. One of those things being, who is your target audience? Is your target students? Are they staff? Are they faculty? Is it just undergraduate students? Is it graduate students? Thinking about who your target is can really just help you to understand what kind of questions do you want to make for them? Are they a little bit more formal? Are they a little bit more informal? What are the goals related to this population that you're looking to understand? Once you have your population, then you can start thinking just a little bit more about your goals. Meaning, the question I always like to ask myself is, if I were to have this data tomorrow, what can I do with it? So really having actionable ideas of what you're going to be doing when you collect this data, because we know everyone's kind of really tired right now. Survey fatigue is hitting very heavy. And in terms of just email inundation and being able to get open rates to start with, can be really difficult. So being very intentional about why you're asking your questions that you're asking, and how you're going about collecting that data can be really important. So some things to get yourself thinking about why you want to do this or what you're doing with the data is how it's going to contribute to what you already know. And then again, what actionable steps can be taken to actually with the data that's being collected. So some things that make a good question, again, these are just tips and tricks that I like to keep in mind when I'm making questions. And they're all pretty normal. They're things that you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, but it might just kind of slip your mind when it comes to actually making things. It's very easy to get caught in the weeds when you're so curious about the things in your area. So one of those things, again, as simple as it sounds, to make it count. If it's something that you already know, if it's something that you have data that exists already that you can get information from, if it's from existing information that you have, like if it's in PeopleSoft or something like that, like maybe you don't need to ask students if they're undergrad or grad, if you have their ID number or things like that. If there's things that you can try to do to avoid kind of having a 20 question survey and you can cut things down to being 10, maybe even 5 questions, and being very intentional about making each question contribute to those actionable insights. That would be helpful for you as the researcher on how much you actually have to analyze afterwards, and also for the students or whoever your target population is, so they don't feel like it's a lot of work for them to have to fill out your survey. One thing at a time, which I'll hit on a little bit, but I'm hitting on double-barreled questions. So things like, is it X and Y? Is this good and effective? Might not be the most easy thing to understand, because if someone's saying yes, you don't know if they're saying yes to one of the things you're asking, to both of those things you're asking, or kind of to what regard. So making sure you're just asking, like, is this an effective method? Or are you satisfied or dissatisfied with this one thing? Can help you to make sure that whatever data you're getting afterwards, you know that they're answering exactly what you're intending them to answer. You don't want to ask leading questions. So having, again, kind of that priming mindset of like, how good is something versus using more neutral terminology. So again, we like to ask things like, instead of just asking, are you satisfied with this one thing? Asking, are you satisfied or dissatisfied? Since it kind of gives both ends of that scale. We're not putting them in this positive mindset because that's the answer we want to get. It's more so just we want to get their natural thoughts when it comes to these things, which is why we're looking for feedback in the first place. Avoiding jargon. I come from an academic background, so using big fancy terms can seem really fun, and almost a habit at some points. But if it's terminology that your target population isn't going to understand off the bat, they might not be able to answer the question in the way that you're hoping them to be able to answer it. So using almost common language, not necessarily in an informal way or informal grammatically, but just using words that people can understand right from the get-go without being like, oh, do I have to Google what that word is? Because again, that's an extra step for them, and that might lead them to either A, not answering the question, B, maybe even closing out of the survey, or again, just not getting the most reliable data from your end. Avoiding fatigue, similar to how I've been saying, kind of make it count. Survey fatigue, again, is just really, really heavy in general on a college campus, but you don't want to keep having one question after another, even if it means like putting everything on one page, avoiding multiple pages of surveys without any idea of when the end is coming for it. You want to make it as mentally easy to read and understand and go through, again, for your end and for the person who's filling out the survey. And then finally, testing it out is really important. We've gotten some really, really great feedback from surveys by having student staff fill things out, or even just other colleagues take a look at our surveys. Things like grammatical errors, like punctuation and things like that as well. But just sometimes I get in my head about things and there's a phrasing that I write and someone else reads it and they have no context for things. And they're like, I don't really quite understand what it is you're trying to say here, or this language just seems unclear. So testing it out, getting extra set of eyes on it is always really great. Especially if you're doing some fancy stuff, if you're in Qualtrics or other things. Just making sure that all of your logic and your survey flow is working properly is really important. So I'll talk a little bit about what's called a Net Promoter Score. Some of you may know this. If you're in student affairs, you've probably heard this 1,700 times at this point. But we use what's called an NPS, or a Net Promoter Score question, in a lot of our surveys. And you've probably seen it a lot if you ever gone to like your doctor's visits or even at airports and things like that, where you engage with some sort of company and they'll send you a survey afterwards that says, how likely are you to recommend our company to a friend? And it'll be on the 0 to 10 scale. And this is actually a specific type of question called an NPS question. And we did pull it from market research. And Amma can speak a little bit about the kind of history of it as well. But the kind of shortened version of it is that it's a way for us to be able to do two things. One, to kind of segment our population of people who are responding to this kind of question, to know whether they're really happy or really not so happy with their experience with whatever we're asking, whether that's at Stony Brook University generally, if it's with an event or anything like that. And then two, it also helps us to create comparisons over time when we start to ask this over time periods or compare different kinds of groups. So just super briefly, basically breaks it down into three different groups. So your 0 to 6s are what are called detractors. They're the ones who are not quite the happiest with whatever their experience is so far. On the opposite end, you have your 9s and 10s, which are your promoters. They're your cheerleaders. They're the ones that are saying, I love Stony Brook. I tell my friends to come here. I've had a really good experience so far. And then you have this middle group, which is called your passives. So it was kind of deemed, and it's definitely questionable. It can be discussed whether a 7-8 is really a passive. Is it really that middle ground? Based on this theory, they've decided that the 7s and 8s are middle ground. And by middle ground, they mean that this group of people could have an experience that could put them either way. One really good experience could turn them into a promoter, or one really not so great experience could kind of push them to be a detractor. And there's kind of a scoring scheme that it is an actual formula. So they take the number of promoters and they subtract it from the number of detractors to kind of get this percentage score. So really it's on a negative 100 to a positive 100 scale if you're into the numbers aspect of this. But all participants, whether they're a detractor, passive, or promoter, is included technically in that formula as the denominator for it.
And maybe just to add a little bit of context, so to Sim's point, this got started in the market research world, but there are lots of other sort of sectors that kind of adopted this approach. And as Sim wisely mentioned to us before, when you're choosing how to design your instrument, what kinds of questions to pick, you're often sort of you're not looking for the worst. You're looking for the best questions, the things that help you get the insight that you're looking for to address the issue that you're interested in. And sometimes that's easier than not. But one of the things that we found with the net promoter score approach, to Sim's point, is it's sort of the most perfectly imperfect approach, or the most imperfectly perfect approach, in the sense that it's usable in lots of different situations, and its utility being so high is one of the reasons that we lean on it. And to Sim's point, that 0 to 10 scale, asking how likely somebody will recommend something or will use something, or whatever the verb is, something, it might seem like it's underdressing or underexpecting, but you'll see, Sim chose a really great example for us, because that utility, you'll see in a second, is one of the reasons that we tend to lean on this question as being one of our design choices pretty consistently. It's not for every case. It's not relevant to every situation or to every population or interest, but it tends to be a pretty useful Swiss knife for us every now and then. But Sim, you have a really great example, I think, that you were going to share with us.
Yeah, so just for context, we do use Qualtrics as our kind of main form, our main survey platform, and NPS questions are built into this. And it has some cool reporting features and things like that. So when you have a net promoter score question type, and it is its own question type there, it puts it into this kind of formatting for you when you see it. I kind of changed it a little bit, but it gives you two charts. It'll give you one chart that's based off the NPS grouping. So it'll give you detractor, passive, promoters, and then it'll also give you the full breakout of the 0 to 10 scale. So for context, again, we use the NPS question in almost every survey that comes out of student affairs, including orientation week, which is called New Seawolf Welcome Week. And we actually do a little bit of framing when it comes to this question. So typically, if you were to take out everything in that kind of question that comes before the comma, that's the baseline of what an NPS question is supposed to be. We give this context of based on your experiences during New Seawolf Welcome Week to kind of ground them in thinking about this specific experience. How likely are you to recommend Stony Brook University to a friend or peer? And this is the general output that we were getting from that, which is pretty typical in honesty of what we tend to see. And it does tell a really cool story. And there are a couple other questions that were really interesting that we asked in there. And again, this is the reason we're going for this, and we'll hit on the design question of surveys in general in a bit. But this storytelling aspect of knowing what it is that you're interested in and how it can really help you, and knowing that beforehand can really help you to design great questions for your survey. So another question we ask is, were the experiences you had during New Seawolf Welcome Week helpful for your first week? Again, this is orientation week, so these are students new and transfer. So like first year and transfer, but all new to Stony Brook. And we send this out in the beginning of the second week of classes, so that way we can ask this specific question of, was this helpful during your first week? Which a lot of students said yes, which makes sense, right? It's not something that's concept like out there of like, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting anything like this. In addition to this question, we also ask, we kind of did a breakout of this. So we asked if Stony Brook, again, was in your top 3 choices for colleges. And when you look at it side by side of whether it was helpful for their first week of classes, that's where we start to see a little bit of discrepancy. So what this chart is essentially telling us is that if Stony Brook was in your top 3 choices for college, then New Seawolf Welcome Week was a lot more helpful to you than students who said Stony Brook was not in their top 3, which for us was a very interesting takeaway because it wasn't quite what we were expecting. We didn't necessarily think that there would be that much of a difference. And there's lots of cool kind of theories that we were coming up with to try to understand this. But for us, one of the things that we decided that might be a takeaway from this is that for the people that said Stony Brook was not in their top 3, it's probably because they were reaching for those Ivies, right? They were like, well, Harvard, and I went for Yale, and I went for Brown, and Stony Brook was kind of my safety school. So they were already probably a little bit more prepared for what college life was going to be like for them compared to students who had Stony Brook as their number 1 choice, their number 2 choice. So it's not that New Seal Welcome wasn't a good experience for them. It just could be that they had a different tool set coming into Stony Brook than those who said Stony Brook was my number 1 choice, right? So this is a kind of story that we didn't have 2 years ago. So to know this now is helping us to change and formulate things now so we can really understand if this is something that's prevalent. Is this a different group of students that we should be keeping an eye out for different kinds of resources and outreach and things like that?
And perfect. And so I think I love that example that Sim has both analyzed and also told the story for for our division and many other stakeholders about, in the sense that today we're talking to you about how to design a questionnaire, how to do it intentionally, strategically, with the end in mind. And that's a lot of kind of context and complexity to keep in mind. But as you could see in the example that Sim shared, if we hadn't asked that second question and we hadn't thought about this is an important cross-tabulation to take a look at, to an analysis to subsequently do, we might assume that everybody is right there in that middle, in that average. And while averages, medians, means, modes, all the stats fanciness is definitely our jam. There's often, without the design side of something like a survey, done well and done intentionally, it's limited. If we had just walked away with an average, we might assume that, 7 in 10 students are this way. But because we had that follow-up question that allowed us to code people, whether it's promoters and detractors, or whether it's people who say Stony Brook is in their top 3 versus not in their top 3, we wouldn't have understood the nuance that goes into saying something is thumbs up or otherwise. So, ultimately, it's helpful to sometimes take a step back because it can seem overwhelming when you're thinking about, I need to have a second master's or a PhD to design this kind of stuff. And then some folks every now and then also feel like, well, surveys are a dime a dozen. How hard can this be? What goes into this complexity? And sometimes what we like to recommend to our clients or folks that we work with is taking a step back and just identifying, why do a survey in the first place? What's the point of approaching it using this tool? Because there are so many tools in our tool belt. And we can give advice about pros and cons and good and bad, but really, a lot of these tools are not, they're independent of that. They're good if they achieve the functionality and utility that you're aiming for. That's really, it's not like surveys are a good thing for our universe morally or ethically. Some of us might believe that because they're awesome at feedback and giving people a voice, but that's more kind of fancy philosophy than it is, the technical stuff. And the technical stuff comes back to, without survey data, we don't necessarily have a means to translate people's opinions, people's passion, context, perception, attitude. That's a really fuzzy thing to do. And if we don't try to do it, as brave and as complex as it can be sometimes, if we don't try to do it, we don't have a great story that we can share with others. We don't always have deep and important insight and context. And again, this is one tool of many. So there are other ways of gathering that information. But that's why it's sometimes important to take a step back and evaluate the pros and cons of any of those tools in terms of putting them into play. Because there are some things that we'll recommend all the time, that this is the right tool for this. And then there are some things where it's really a judgment choice. Surveys, for example, are a great opportunity to check in to guess whether, and I don't mean guess like flip a coin, but introspectively understand whether a focus group, an in-depth interview, a structured interview, a semi-structured interview, a convenience sample, a something on a stand at a doorway that somebody sees a smiley face and a frown face. Maybe that's the right tool to put into play. And so, again, surveys sometimes, depending on our kind of our experience and background, they might seem like they're the right tool or maybe even the only tool, but in reality, connecting with the folks at OEE, the Office of Educational Effectiveness, or us at Craft, or any number of folks that do this on a day-to-day, that can help a lot with kind of connecting that next step in the process and making sure that you're applying the right tool to the right goal. And speaking of, actually, Sim, if you could go to the next slide, that process, just wanted to share a couple extra points on this. So as Sim so wisely shared, what you want to do is important for lots of reasons. And actually, maybe to go to the next slide, I'll show you one of those most important reasons is because how you tell that story has a lot to do with the tools that you used to derive the data, to gather the information that you want to communicate. So I just want to share a shout out to, if anybody's ever met her, and I think if Catherine Scott's still on the call, I feel like you all brought Stephanie Evergreen to campus once. And I am just such a fan of her. Like, she is amazing in so many ways. And one of the things that she does really well is talk about how your information can be best communicated from an accessibility standpoint in terms of red-green color blindness, all the way to you want to tell a timeline story, and that really involves these kinds of things, or you want to show complexity for something that's part of a bunch of other things. Actually, a dendrogram is really great for that. It shows hierarchy and organized structure and all of these things. So again, if we go to the next slide, that sort of it's a really quick allusion to us making the case. If anything that we can leave you with is that there are a bunch of do's and don'ts, a bunch of best practices out there, but ultimately asking yourself some of these questions: who you're trying to reach, what you're trying to say about them, how you think that thing can be best said, whether it's a PowerPoint or a narrative, a presentation that's verbal, or a website that's built, or a flip book that's interactive. All of those things are ultimately going to go into, am I using the right tool? And then once you identify, is this the right tool? Are these the tweaks that I should make to that potential tool? That's really where, ultimately for Sim and I, the fun is in designing the questionnaire. The tough part where we earn our keep and kind of the complexity that goes into, and also our job security, is in the thought process, the strategy, the kind of comprehensive approach that we take to some of these things. And so, we just wanted to leave you with that, maybe a couple extra things to keep in mind. Just if you could go to the next slide, there are some similarly important questions to ask yourself and maybe the stakeholders that you're working with in terms of, do I need certain questions? Do I need to include certain insights? Demographics are a great example of this that we hit on pretty frequently. Sometimes it's really important to the ultimate insight that you're trying to deliver to differentiate between, let's say, a gender or a race or ethnic coding or some other breakout. Sometimes that's really important. Sometimes that's not so important. And we've just grown accustomed to including those questions just because it's a common practice. And so it's really important in some situations to kind of, again, ask yourself that question, but also see how you might implicate it in your design. Maybe those sensitive questions might go towards the tail end. Maybe there are some questions that are really aligned with that goal, that you want to identify this identity versus that identity. And so you want to keep them kind of in the forefront. And so again, you'll hear Sim share some really good advice about do's and don'ts, but ultimately, or I should say, and ultimately, it also should be really aligned ultimately with the goal that you're trying to achieve, the insight that you're trying to deliver, the thing that you're curious about and you want to sort of represent for the rest of the world. And so the next slide has a couple of good examples of some, if folks are interested in doing some reading. Nate Silver and Kathy O'Neill are two other superstars in this field. Arguably, they do have a bunch of opinion in these books, so I'll put that caveat out there. But these books are a couple of good examples. Specifically, the one on your left is called The Signal and the Noise. And then the one on the right is called Weapons of Math Destruction. And the sort of general philosophy, or at least the thesis behind both of these, is some of these tools we use wisely and they help us do really important things. And sometimes these tools can have some pitfalls that are not so obvious to consider. And so, they both tell a really powerful story along kind of some of those warnings. And then the next thing that I'll leave you with, and then I'll stop talking and share it back over to Sim, is really ultimately, if I had to kind of boil it down to the most important takeaways, keeping a survey as short and as simple as possible checks off so many important boxes. Shortness or brevity unlocks really important analysis bandwidth. So what I mean by that really convoluted sentence is a really long and complicated survey feels like it just addresses the things that you need and then some. The risk of and then some is that now you have to spend time to analyze that. And that's not always time that we have available. And if we don't analyze the information that comes from a survey, it's unfortunate because it's somebody's expression of their feedback and their opinion. And if we don't do something with it, that might not make them feel great. And not only, not that this is about feelings, but in addition to that, it also ends up undercutting, the process and the efficiency and all that. And so simplicity is a similar kind of, annotation there, that keeping it simple also means that to the recipient, to the participant, to the person that you're targeting, that they don't need to spend a lot of brain power, what sometimes we call cognitive load, figuring out what you're trying to ask them. And Sim made some excellent points about double-barreled questions and simple aligned answers. And that's really what that boils down to. Now, that doesn't mean that your curiosity should stay simple or should stay short or should stay limited. But what that could mean is that you might have to kick yourself into a sort of a prioritization gear where you're looking at the things that are most important to your goals, and then you organize the next set of things that are, really also important, but maybe not as important. And then ultimately the things that are like kind of cool to know, but if we have time and space and energy. And so by doing that kind of categorization, then you can really put some of the best practices that Sim and I will share with you, in terms of, this is the most refined set of questions. And then we have these really cool brainstorming questions, but we'll save them for a future time and date. So sorry, Sim, throwing it back over to you. Go for it.
Oh, totally good. So I think I'm gonna hit on a lot of these best practices when it comes to, like, again, designing your actual survey in terms of cognitive load, right? Asking similar things with each other, not like spreading them out. Wanting your first questions to be probably the most important ones that you're interested in. If you had to have people only answer the first two questions of your survey, are you putting the most important questions at the forefront of your survey? Just in case people click out, are you getting what you need to, at least for the bare minimum? Which kind of goes back to that kind of must know, useful to know, nice to know. That'll help you kind of design what kind of questions you want to ask and when you want to ask it. In that similar vein, I'll like briefly touch on these since we're about to run out of time. If you need to hop off, totally fine. There's open-ended questions and also closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions just being basically your free text questions. They allow people to write anything that they would like to express whatever they're feeling based on how you phrase that questions. Not necessarily anything that's right or wrong, and just come with that qualitative aspect of data analysis, which can be time consuming, but as someone that does it a lot, you can get some really, really interesting feedback and ideas that you wouldn't really get with closed-ended questions. It leads people to be able to express things that you didn't even know was something that was on people's mind, which can really influence how you go about any assessment going forward. And again, closed-ended questions are just kind of your multiple choice, your multi-select, and anything where you're kind of providing the options and they're choosing from those. So we'll just hit like very briefly on just a couple of best practices. Like I mentioned, double-barreled questions. So something like this, where you're asking, do you personally subscribe to, regularly read any periodicals, magazines, newsletters that are related to your occupation? If I answer yes to this, you have no idea what part of that question I'm saying yes to. I could say in my head, well, I mean, I read newsletters, but not really the other stuff, but I guess that counts as a yes. But you as the researcher don't really know that that's my mindset when thinking about it. So a different way of going about it is more of kind of side-by-side, multi-select kind of situation. So in this case, I'm saying, do you subscribe, do you not subscribe, and listing those same items. But now I can select which ones specifically I do and in what regard. So now you can actively say, I know what the student is answering. Similar vein, you want to make sure that each question, again, is easy to answer. So if I'm asking you, if you made dinner at home last night, how many minutes did it take you to prepare a meal? This question may or may not require an answer because it's saying, if you made dinner at home last night. I didn't make dinner at home last night. I Uber Eats for dinner last night. So that is technically, I guess, 0 minutes. Or I could leave it blank. But again, as a researcher, you don't know if why they're putting 0 minutes. You don't know if they skipped that question because they just didn't want to answer it or whatever the case is. So maybe having 2 questions of like, did you make dinner at home? And if they select yes, then you can have a second question appear of how many minutes did it take. So that's basically some general best practices. Again, at Stony Brook, you do have a Qualtrics, you do have full access to Qualtrics to use its capabilities. And we do kind of help, we give you guys a little bit on the PowerPoint of some of the phrasings we use. So if you ever want to add demographic questions, this is how we tend to ask gender. This is how we'll ask race, ethnicity, and NPS questions. And there's some kind of links and resources for you as well. And if you are interested, we are hosting a second session on Wednesday. Something survey matchmaking is in the title. I cannot tell you the full title off the top of my head, but it exists and it's at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, where we'll be talking a little bit more about tools, Qualtrics being one of them. So if you're interested in more of an intro to what Qualtrics can potentially offer you and some other platforms like SurveyMonkey and all of that, you can feel free to join us there as well. But thank you for staying 3 minutes over. We very much appreciate your time. And if you have any questions or anything, you can always feel free to email any of us. Cool.
Thank you. I just have a question. Will the slides be available to click on the hyperlinks?
Yes. So I already put it into a PDF format. So after the session is done, I will send it out to everyone. And I did test it and they should all be clickable links. If they're not, though, you can feel free to let me know so I can fix it and I can just send it to you personally.
Thank you.
No problem. Great.
All
Awesome.
right. Thank you
Thank
for a
you all
great
so
presentation,
much.
Sim and Ahmed. Happy Love Data Week, everyone.
Oh, you too. It's our pleasure. See you soon.